हाँ सबको आवाज भी आ रही है, प्लीज मुझे बता दें। हेलो।
जी मैम, शुरू कर दीजिए क्लास। ओके।
अच्छा सही, थैंक यू। Okay, so today we are going to discuss about the diarrhea and the dysentery and the organism causing these diarrhea and dysentery. My name is Dr. Fouzia Zeeshan, and today we'll discuss about these. This lecture basically is comprised of two lectures. This topic is comprised of two lectures. Today we will discuss about the basics of the diarrhea and dysentery and the agents, including viruses and bacteria. And tomorrow, hopefully, we will discuss about the parasites. So the learning objectives are, at the end of lecture, all the students should know about the difference between the diarrhea and the dysentery, medical important pathogens, pathogenesis of disease, diagnostic test, clinical course, and the management. So basically, what is diarrhea? Usually when we talk about the diarrhea, we have one picture in our mind that they are increase in number of stools. It could be watery stool, it could be semi-solid stools, or it could be stools along with any blood. Usually diarrhea is associated with increase in mucus in stools. And when we talk about the blood in stools, it means that we are talking about the dysentery or the bacillary dysentery that is caused by Shigella, which is one of the more notorious organism that causing dysentery. So there are different types of diarrhea, but before going into the types of diarrhea, we should know the typical classification of diarrhea, that is acute diarrhea and the chronic diarrhea. Acute diarrhea, basically it lasts less than 2 weeks or 15 days, and it usually stops spontaneously without any medication. The chronic diarrhea is comprised of more than 2 weeks. So this is the broad classification of the diarrhea. Well, in many books or on internet, you will come across with different types like inflammatory diarrhea, like infectious diarrhea, like absorptive diarrhea. So there are lots of classification, but what I have done that I have uh, uh, classified into a broader four classification. So first of all is secretory diarrhea. What is secretory diarrhea? Basically, uh, basically water secreted into the small intestine, but it is efficiently absorbs before reaching to the large intestine or the colon. Toxins that are present, there are certain type of toxins like the preformed toxins, like in case of food poisoning, what happens, a person ingest a food which contains preformed toxins, and there are some enterotoxins that are produced by the microorganisms that ingested by the person in case of taking any food. So in case of secretory diarrhea, what happens, these toxins, they activate adenyl cyclase activity. Adenyl cyclase are the different enzymes that are present in the brush borders of the epithelial cells. And I'm not going into the detail of the physiology of these cyclic AMP activity or at the adenyl cyclase, but you should remember that these are the enzyme that causes increased intracellular cyclic AMP within the crypts of the intestinal brush borders. I'm sure that you will have an idea about what are the intestinal crypts, what are the villi. These are the structures that are helpful for the absorption of the water as well as for the different materials. So what happens when there is increased intracellular cyclic AMP within the crypts, that leads to open up chloride channels that secretes water from the crypts, and therefore there are different toxins that behave in that way. So secretory diarrhea usually associated with the opening of the adenyl cyclase that further increase the entry of cyclic AMP. And there are lots of agents which causes secretory diarrhea, like certain hormones, like vasoactive intestinal peptides, certain metals, certain drugs, especially those drugs which are taken for asthma and the cardiac problems, some laxatives. So what happens? This secretory diarrhea starts when we talk about the osmotic diarrhea. Basically what happened that osmotic diarrhea is a balance or is an activity between the stool output and the intake of an unabsorbed food. Absorption of water intestine is depend on adequate absorption of solutes. If excess amount of solute are in intestine, so the water will not absorb. Like if there are a lot of solutes are present in the intestine, so the absorption of water will be limited, and it causes the diarrhea to occur. So what are the cases in which the osmotic diarrhea usually occur? Like ingestion of a poorly absorbed substances like carbohydrates, or in case of malabsorptions like lactose intolerance due to the deficiency of lactase which is consumed, but due to the lactose which is consumed, but due to the deficiency of enzyme lactase, it cannot hydrolyze in glucose and galactose. So this lactose is retained in intestinal lumen and it holds water. It stops water to get reabsorbed, and in this way water will be secreted in the form of diarrhea. So these are the major like the reasons that how secretory diarrhea and osmotic diarrhea is. When we talk about the malabsorptive diarrhea, it usually, in case of malabsorption, what happens? The organism, they covers epithelium and causes mucosal inflammation. So what happens in case of prolonged malabsorption? Villi get flattened, and it could be due to some genital effect or some defect in ion transport system, or defect in hydrolysis of substances, or impaired entero hepatic circulation. So what happens that it leads to the mucosal damage, and so the malabsorptions occurs. The food will not be absorbed the way it has to absorb, or in case of certain pathologies like pancreatic insufficiency. So these are the ways like the why malabsorptive diarrhea occurs. Malabsorptive diarrhea further is divided into further types like intraluminal digestion, terminal digestion, transepithelial digestion, lymphatic transport of absorbed um lipids. What happens in case of intraluminal digestion? Usually, intraluminal digestion involves the or you can say that it starts from the digestion of saliva, gastric peptic digestion, small bowel digestion, and the bile salts. Right? So, what happens in this case if there is insufficient digestion at the level of this intraluminal? So, it will lead to malabsorptive diarrhea. In case of terminal digestion, what's happened? The hydrolysis of carbohydrates, like I have just told you that in case of lactose intolerance, which is unable to hydrolyze into the glucose and the galactose due to the deficiency of the lactase enzyme. So what happens that the hydrolysis of carbohydrates and the peptides occurs in the brush border of a small intestine. So what happens that if there is any defect in the digestion of these carbohydrates or the peptides, so this will leads to the inefficient terminal digestion. So these are the different steps. Like in case of transepithelial digestion, what happens that it usually occurs across the small bowel epithelium to intestinal vasculature. So if there is any defect in the transport of materials from the small bowel epithelium to intestinal vascular, so it leads to abnormality of this transepithelial digestion. Lymphatic transport, where usually it due to it taken place by taking absorbed lipids. But if there is something wrong with this transport channels, so because lymphatic channels are running in our body at different levels, so if in case of any defect in this lymphatic transport system of absorbed lipids, so it will leads to malabsorptive diarrhea. In case of exudative diarrhea, it usually occurs with the presence of blood and the pus in the stool. And it is more common in inflammatory bowel diseases, inflammatory conditions like ulcerative colitis, and severe infections like caused by the E.coli, which we'll discuss later on. And in case of severe food poisoning, so these are the different classes of diarrhea, and I'm sure that everybody would have understood by now. So let's move on. So look at this chart. In this chart, they have discussed about the diseases and the level of malabsorption that further leads to diarrheal disease. Similarly, like in celiac disease, what happens? There's a defect in terminal digestion. In tropical flu, again, terminal digestion and transepithelial transport defect. In case of chronic pancreatitis, cystic fibrosis, primary bile acid malabsorption occurs at intraluminal level. And autoimmune enteropathy, disaccharide deficiency, it occurs at terminal digestion. So in this way, they have discussed the different diseases of the malabsorptive diarrhea and the level at which the problem is occurring. So I hope that everyone has understood. You can ask me at the end of question if anything you want understand. Now we are discussing about causative agent. Obviously, we have bacteria, viral, and the protozoa. In bacterial causes, we have a lots of bacteria, but I am showing you here the most common causative agents like Campylobacter jejuni, Salmonella species, Shigella, E.coli, Enterocolitis, Bacillus cereus, Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum, and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. When we talk about the viral are rotavirus, noro, adenoviruses, and protozoa, entamoeba, giardia, crypto, and schistosomiasis. High risk group usually have extreme age group like adults above 50 or the young ones. Environmental factors are also associated with medication. Certain drugs are responsible for causing diarrhea. If the person is having other diseases or other comorbidities, so it will be he or she will be more prone to gain this diarrhea. Travelers are more at high risk group because when they travel from one country to another country, the chance of intaking contaminated water and the food is more higher, so it will leads to diarrhea. Route of transmission is always orophageal. Remember that it is a gastrointestinal problem, so it will not caused by some contact, physical contact, or airborne infections. The route is always orophageal. Pathogenesis basically depends upon the number of bacteria, that how much bacteria are present inside the food or which have been taken in case of food poisoning, or how much bacteria are alive inside of the intestinal tract to cause diarrhea. If the number of bacteria are less, or you can say that it is below the infectious dose, so it might not cause any pathology or any infection. Toxicity again depends on the number of bacteria. If the number of bacteria are more and they are in the dividing phase and they are releasing their toxins, so the toxicity level would be higher. Invasiveness means that the how the bacteria start to produce toxins and start harming the intestinal tract of a human body. It consists of attachment. First, it attaches to the epithelial cells of the intestine. Then it will penetrate, that will it get inside to the epithelial cells, and after that it will start dividing. That's called the multiplication. So this is a chart in which it is very clearly shown. First, the bacteria enters into this intestine, it penetrates the mucus layer, then it enters into the epithelial cells and start multiplying. Normally, we have normal bacterial flora that produces IgA, right? So it prevents attachment. This normal flora is present in all human beings. It is the immune system, it's part of the immune system of our body. So when the number of bacteria and the toxicity level are more, and the patient is already immunocompromised or is already experiencing हेलो जी आ रही है आवाज
जी मैम, शेयर स्क्रीन आ रही है आपकी?
आ रही
फुल
है
स्क्रीन कर दीजिए।
ठीक है हेलो
जी मैम, शुरू कर दीजिए लेक्चर।
चलें अच्छा जी हम लोग सॉरी फॉर द इनकन्वीनियंस. So we were here in this picture. I have just discussed about the how the bacteria they enters into the intestine and they penetrate the mucous membrane. Then they multiply in the epithelial cells. In after the multiplication, they start releasing their toxins and causing inflammation. Due to the inflammation, what happens? There is a vasal constriction occurs, and some other endotoxins also releases that causes fever and other and the release of different proteins. Then after the vasal constriction, what happens? There is a superficial mucosal necrosis and ulceration occurs, and then what happens? There is an increased secretion of water instead of absorption, and due to the inflammation there is accumulation of blood and pus along with the diarrhea, along with this watery secretion that's called the diarrhea. So this sort of pathogenesis basically is more involved in case of bloody diarrhea, because when there is mucosal ulceration necrosis occurs, so there is a sufficient amount of blood will be released, and this blood will get mixed with the water that is present inside the lumen of the intestine, which is not getting reabsorbed. So ultimately it leads to the bloody diarrhea. Mucosal adherence, basically what happens, there is an adhesion at the tip of the villi, and after the adhesion they causes lesions on the villi the villi are they are like finger-like projections. If you remember the physiology of the villi, and they are finger-like projections, which are very helpful in absorption. So what happens in case of diarrhea? The finger-like projections will be converted into flattening of the villi, and this will lead to non-reabsorption of fluid and water, and ultimately it leads to watery diarrhea. Mucosal invasiveness, what happens? There is a destruction of the epithelial lining, and this is more common with Shigella that causes bloody diarrhea. Enteroinvasiveness of E.coli and Campi, that is the Campylobacter jejuni. Enterotoxins that are released by the Staph aureus and the Vibrio cholerae, and the cytotoxins that are released by the Salmonella and enterohemorrhagic E. coli. Bacterial causes of watery diarrhea and dysentery. There's a list of organisms that is very, very important, that you should know that which organism is associated with the dysentery or the bloody diarrhea, and the which organism is associated with the watery diarrhea. In case of watery diarrhea, what happens? There's a Vibrio cholerae, enterotoxigenic E. coli, enteropathogenic E. coli, Salmonella, Clostridium difficile, Clostridium perfringens, Campylobacter jejuni, Bacillus cereus, Staph aureus. So these are the organisms that are linked with the watery diarrhea. This is very, very, very important. If I'm saying that something is important, that it means important for the examination point of view. You should know that which organism is associated with the watery diarrhea or the dysentery. In case of dysentery, we have a list of Shigella, Yersinia, Campylobacter, jejuni species, enteroinvasive E. coli, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, and the that is EHEC. Again, this is the different types of organisms along with the geographical area, their transmission, their their epidemiology, and the part they are linked with. Like some organisms, they act on the small intestine, some organisms act on the large intestine, and the complications are associated with. Vibrio cholerae. Vibrio cholerae is one of the most important pathogen that is causes diarrhea, and the most pathognomic of the Vibrio cholerae is causing rice water stools. The consistency of the diarrhea is like a rice water. So this is one of the most pathognomic feature of this Vibrio cholerae. It is associated with the intake of contaminated water. It is non-invasive. Like it usually Vibrio cholerae is associated with the acute conditions of the diarrhea, right? And it produces cholera toxins that are very, very important, causing the pathogenesis, and it is epidemically present. Like it is not found normally throughout the year. There is a seasonal variation. Like it comes in specific season. Clinical features, usually it is asymptomatic, but in case of severe disease, there's a vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, muscle cramps. If the patient is not treated properly, then it will cause the shocked unconsciousness and death. So this is not important. I have just shown you that how these changes occurs. It is just for your information, and I have discussed initially that what happens that in case of the toxin, that toxin it binds with the proteins, and the toxin, when it enters inside the cell, it changes the whole you can say that the whole ion transport system, or it will affect the Golgi apparatus. Then it causes the retrograde transport system. Then after that, basically, in short, this picture is not very important, but just showing you that how it occurs. So it causes GDB to convert into the GTP, and in this process NAD also releases. So this active GTP, it causes opening of the adenylate cyclase. This adenylate cyclase, again it opens the channels of potassium ions, that causes release of water secretions inside the lumen, which is further secreted out of the body in the form of diarrhea. Campylobacter jejuni, it is usually found in developed countries and it's associated with traveler's diarrhea. It is linked with the improperly cooked food or unpasteurized milk. Its virulent factors are associated with mortality, toxin production. It also produces cholera-like toxins and it causes invasion. One thing you should appreciate that all the organisms are not causing invasiveness. Some some organisms just adhere to the epithelium and produces their toxins, which produces further pathogenesis of the diarrhea. All organisms are not linked with the invasiveness of the epithelium. Clinical features are they are linked with dysentery, that is a bloody diarrhea, enteric fever, and the complications are it causes reactive arthritis, other extraintestinal symptoms like erythema nodosum, and 40% cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré syndrome basically is a paralysis. It is an ascending paralysis that starts from the lower. It starts from the lower body parts and it starts from the lower limbs and it moves upwards. So that is the ascending paralysis. Diagnosis is stool culture is the gold standard. Otherwise, if the organism is not easily find out in school culture, so the biopsy is also recommended. But in case of biopsy is linked or it is recommended in advanced stages of diarrhea, like if the person is having a very prolonged diarrhea and it is not getting out of it, so the doctor will suspect some um, comorbid like carcinoma, so they will go for the biopsy. Clostridium difficile is associated with antibiotic associated diarrhea, like if the person is taking vancomycin, some beta-lactam antibiotics. Initially, it was assumed that only the vancomycin was a culprit of antibiotic-associated diarrhea, but there are certain other antibiotics as well, like beta-lactams, ceftriaxone, cephalosporin groups of antibiotics that are also responsible for this antibiotic-associated diarrhea, and it forms a membranous-like structure inside the intestine that's called the pseudomembranous, and colitis means that the inflammation of the colon. So that forms a false membrane inside the colon. Shigella is again the root is fecal oral root. Infective dose is very feeble. Like if 100 organisms are found inside the intestinal tract, so it will cause disease. As I have told you earlier, that the number of bacteria is very important. Like in some cases, what happens there a lot of bacteria are required to cause disease, but in case of certain organisms, few few organisms can also cause disease. It is associated with migrant workers, like in places where there is a close contact, like in daycare centers, like in hospitals, like in some conferences or in a close areas. Usually, a Shigella is not easily killed by the HCl that is present inside our stomach. So it is more found in the left colon, and it's usually symptomatic. And self-limited, but if the condition is getting worse, so it will be life-threatening. The complications are hemolytic uremic syndrome that is caused by enterohemorrhagic E.coli, reactive arthritis, conjunctivitis, and urethritis. Type 3 secretion system is very, very important because some bacteria have typical type 3 secretion system that is very helpful in causing this diarrhea and the dysentery, like the Salmonella, like Shigella, like E.coli. So it's a basically protein appendage. You can see that there is a complete system is a protein appendage that is found in some gram-negative bacteria. It is consisting of a tip. This is the needle,
This is basically the export apparatus, a needle filament which is protrude out of the bacterial surface. Then there is a tip which forms translocation pores in the eukaryotic cells, right? That allows the entry. This is the host cell membrane or the eukaryotic cells. This tip will penetrate this host cell membrane or the eukaryotic cell, and it will inject its toxins. You can say that it's a system of needle complex that is consists of the needle and the basal body. So this system is acquired by certain gram-negative bacteria, but not all. Salmonella causes typhoid, salmonellosis. It is found in developing countries. Like we had very bad epidemic of typhoid nowadays, as well as in last few days. And it also associated with type 3 secretion system. Okay. Clinical features, it starts with the loose stools, then to cholera like profuse diarrhea and fever.
मैम आपकी एक्सक्यूज मी मैम आपकी वॉइस हल्की आ रही है, थोड़ा माइक थोड़ा
सही आ रही है?
जी मैम अब ठीक है.
अच्छा. Organism can be shed in the stool for several weeks after, even if the person who is having who was having typhoid or salmonella infection, so the person will keep on shedding the organism in the stool even after the resolution of the disease. Typhoid has two types, that is typhi and the paratyphi. S typhi is in endemic areas, whereas paratyphi is associated with travelers, and it is associated with contaminated food. S typhi is one of the toughest bacteria that can survive in gastric acid environment of the stomach, and they invade the mononuclear cells, and they disseminate, or they spread throughout the body by the lymphatics and the blood vessels. So it causes reactive hyperplasia of phagocytes and lymphoid tissues. Morphology, the important thing is that it causes longitudinal ulcers, oval ulcers. You can see this. This is very obvious. That is in the terminal ileum and the colon pair pages, there is a longitudinal ulcers. And the ulcer margins are raised, and the base is sloughed, like the base is not prominent, and it is sort of blackish in color, but the margins are quite raised. So it is well appreciated over here. Clinical features are usually common. That is anorexia, bloating, nausea, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, and it has got a short asymptomatic phase, then the bacteremia and fever with flu-like symptoms. E. coli is enterotoxigenic E. coli that is associated with traveler's diarrhea. That is very, very important. Usually we have enterotoxigenic E. coli in adults. It is associated with contaminated food and more common in less than 2 years of age. It has got two toxins, that is heat labile and heat stable toxins. So enteropathogenic E. coli is found in the developed and the developing countries, and outbreak are more common again in less than 2 years of age. Then enterohemorrhagic is very, very important. O157H7 is a serotype that's also called the Shigella-like toxin, and it causes bloody diarrhea and also causes hemolytic uremic syndrome and ischemic colitis. Enteroinvasive E. coli, that is very similar to the Shigella and transmitted by the food or by person to person, and they do not usually they do not produce toxins, but they invade epithelial cells. So that is the very important point you should remember. Then enteroaggregative E. coli that adhere to the epithelial cells associated with the traveler's diarrhea. It is non-bloody diarrhea. It could be a non-bloody diarrhea, prolonged it is more prolonged in individual with HIV infection. Clostridium difficile is associated with antibiotic, and the symptoms are almost the same. Very few changes are found in different bacteria, like it is more associated with leukocytosis. Leukocytosis is clinical picture is a lab diagnosis that is associated with Clostridium difficile, associated with cramping, dehydration, fever, and it is more commonly diagnosed by the serology test rather than the culture. We are not doing the cultures, but we are going for the serology test or the histopathological changes. These are the whitish pussy pseudomembrane that is covered the intestine. Here you can find this. This is structure that is greenish in color. That is all pussy membrane. These were the references I have taken for preparation of this lecture. Any question, please? Any question? Shigella is endemic in developing countries because we don't have a proper hygienic conditions, right? The problem in developing countries that the hygiene is very poor, and we do not have any vaccine for that, so they are more commonly present. Type 3 secretion system is normally present in some gram-negative bacteria. This is a typical, you can say, the assembly of protein, right? And they are involved in ejecting the toxins, preformed toxins or the exotoxins through a preformed assembly of you can resemble it with a syringe. What happens when we get any IV injections or any IV drip? So what happens? There is a needle which penetrates the skin, and then the drug will be pumped into the skin via the nozzle. So you can just resemble it with this type 3 secretion system. So this is there's a common thing through which the bacteria injected its toxins and the effectors inside the host cells. Okay, you can take this lecture from me. Basically, osmotic diarrhea is the diarrhea which is linked due to the inabsorption of water inside the small intestine and the colon. What happens when there is an increased amount of substrate is present? As I have told you the example of lactose insufficiency or the lactose intolerance. What happens that lactose is a carbohydrate, right? So lactose hydrolyzed into glucose and galactose, right? And then these glucose and galactose will further get digested inside the small intestine. But what happens when there is a deficiency of enzyme lactase, which is helpful in the hydrolysis of lactose? So the lactose is present in a bulk amount, and when there is anything which is not digestible and present in a bulk amount, so it will also stops water to get reabsorbed inside the small intestine or the colon. So what happens that this water will secrete out the body in the form of diarrhea. So this is the osmotic diarrhea, like it osmotically stops the water to get absorbed inside the colon or the small intestine. Any question further? Any question? Okay, sure, I will give the references. You can okay, wait, I'm showing the references. Here are the references. I hope everyone can see that. Any question? Any question? Any question? I hope everyone can hear me now. I'm very regretting the inconvenience that has been occurred during the lecture. Actually, there were some problem with the computer and their IT system. So I'm very sorry for this inconvenience. You
एक्सक्यूज
can
मी मैम जी मैम
I would have
अस्सलाम वालेकुम
जी
क्लास एंड कर दूं
चलें कर दें ठीक है
ओके मैम और कोई तो नहीं क्वेश्चन मैडम
क्वेश्चन
स्टूडेंट
पूछ लें लोगों से इफ दे वांट टू आस्क एनी क्वेश्चन कल भी मेरी क्लास है सुबह में तो हम कल भी कंटिन्यू कर सकते हैं क्वेश्चंस
ओके मैम ठीक है अल्लाह हाफ़िज़
ठीक है अल्लाह